Late 1944. Germany was being pushed back on every front. Ammunition was low, soldiers were exhausted, and worst of all, the mighty panzer divisions were running out of fuel. But then, an unexpected discovery, 50,000 gallons of American gasoline, revealed a truth that doomed the entire German war effort. This is the story of how a single fuel depot exposed the fatal weakness of Hitler's elite armored forces. Desperate to change the momentum of the war, Hitler launched one last massive counteroffensive through the dense Ardennes forest. The goal: split the Allied armies, drive to the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. To spearhead this bold attack, he chose his most feared armored formation, Kampfgruppe Peiper, led by SS Colonel Joachim Peiper. They had the best tanks Germany could field, Panthers and Tigers, powerful, heavily armored, but with one critical flaw. The Tiger and Panther tanks were engineering marvels, but they consumed massive amounts of fuel. And by 1944, Germany's oil situation was catastrophic. Romanian oil fields were lost, synthetic fuel plants were bombed, and supply lines were collapsing. Peiper began the operation with barely half the fuel he needed. The success of the entire offensive depended on capturing Allied fuel along the way, a dangerously unrealistic plan. As Peiper's column pushed deeper into Belgium, the situation worsened. Tanks sputtered to a halt. Vehicles were abandoned. Cold weather, narrow forest roads, and constant Allied resistance slowed everything down. Then came a stroke of luck. In the small village of Honsfeld, Peiper's men stumbled upon an American supply depot, stacked with over 50,000 gallons of gasoline. For the German troops, it felt like a miracle. But to Peiper, it revealed a devastating truth. As soon as the tanks were refueled and the engines thundered back to life, the German column began moving again. But something had changed, something deeper than the sound of engines or the renewed movement of the vehicles. The officers, the tank crews, even the infantry walking along the ditches, they all felt it. The miraculous discovery of fuel had given them life, yes, but it had also opened a door they were not prepared to look through. As the column advanced out of the village, the landscape around them felt colder, more desolate. The snow-covered trees seemed to close in like silent witnesses. The fuel barrels they had just claimed were American. Clearly marked, clearly foreign. They weren't the product of German industry, or German planning, or German strength. They were leftovers, abandoned supplies from an enemy that had so much fuel it could afford to leave entire depots behind. The realization spread slowly at first, like a whisper. Soldiers didn't talk about it openly, but they were thinking the same thing. If Germany's most elite armored force had been running on fumes, if their tanks had rolled into battle with barely enough fuel to reach the first objective, then what did that say about the true state of the war? Inside the command vehicle, the officers were already discussing the numbers. Even with the captured fuel, they didn't have enough to complete the original plan. They were calculating distances, consumption rates, the condition of the engines, the time lost from delays. Every calculation pointed in the same direction. The offensive no longer had momentum. It had become a desperate push, held together by luck and improvisation, and luck in war always runs out. As they pushed deeper, resistance stiffened. American troops regrouped faster than expected. Roadblocks appeared. Artillery fire intensified. Air patrols returned as the weather cleared. Every hour made it clearer that the enemy was growing stronger, while the German column, even after refueling, was slowly bleeding out. Some tanks, even with full fuel, began to fail mechanically. The cold snapped cables, jammed gears, and froze lubricants. Men pushed and pulled, trying to force life back into machines that had endured far more than they were designed for. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Powerful machines built for sweeping offensives, now limping forward like exhausted beasts. The captured fuel hadn't saved the operation, it had exposed it. It revealed the enormous gap between the German war machine as it appeared on paper and the harsh logistical reality on the ground. Germany could still build formidable tanks, gather elite troops and plan bold offensives, but it could no longer support them. It couldn't fuel them, feed them, or maintain them at the scale required for victory. The men continued marching. The tanks continued rumbling. But morale, true morale, never fully returned. That brief surge of hope they felt when they discovered the fuel depot had faded into something else. A quiet, heavy understanding They were fighting to push forward, but the larger war was pushing back stronger than ever. And as the column made its way deeper into the Ardennes, every soldier, from the youngest infantryman to the highest-ranking officer, knew what the captured fuel really meant. It wasn't salvation, it was a sign. A sign that the offensive was running on borrowed time and borrowed resources. A sign that the end was approaching faster than anyone wanted to admit. As the column continued pushing forward, the tension inside every vehicle became almost physical, as if the air itself was tightening around them. They were still advancing, but it no longer felt like an offensive. It felt like a retreat in slow motion, except the direction was forward. Each mile they gained demanded a price they could no longer afford to pay. The terrain grew worse. Narrow forest paths, blown-out bridges, and clogged roads forced the tanks into single-file lines that stretched for kilometers. Every time the lead vehicle slowed, the entire column stalled, leaving them exposed to artillery and airstrikes. Soldiers crouched in ditches, clutching their weapons as they listened to the distant hum of engines overhead. They knew what that sound meant. The skies were no longer a shield for them, they were a threat. When the first American airstrikes came, they came fast. Bombs tore through trees, turning them into splinters that cut through uniforms and skin. Tanks scrambled for cover among the pines, but the forest offered little protection. Flames lit the snow. Smoke drifted upward in long black streaks. The Germans fired back when they could, but their ammunition was dwindling just like everything else. Within hours, several vehicles were destroyed, not because they were outmaneuvered, but because they simply couldn't move. The column that once symbolized the spearhead of a grand offensive now looked like a trail of broken, burning steel. Officers shouted orders that few could follow. Radio communication was collapsing. Everyone was operating half-blind. The worst part wasn't the bombs or the bullets or even the cold. It was the silence that followed. A silence filled with something they had never felt on this scale before. Inevitability. Fuel was running out again. Food supplies were almost gone. The men had been marching on half rations for days. Some units resorted to melting snow for water, while others scoured abandoned barns hoping to find anything edible. The once proud armored division now looked more like a wandering caravan of exhausted, starving soldiers. Inside the tanks, the crews sat in darkness, engines turned off to save fuel. Their breath formed clouds in the freezing air. They stared at the gauges, knowing the needles were dropping too low to continue. They weren't thinking about victory anymore. They were thinking about survival. Then came the order that sealed their fate. Not an attack command, not a rally, not even a defensive regroup. It was a withdrawal, a full, undeniable retreat. These same men who had marched forward, believing they were part of a decisive blow, were now turning back, leaving behind vehicles they could no longer fuel or repair. They abandoned tanks, machines they had trained on for months because they simply had no way to keep them running. Some crews smashed their own equipment to prevent it from being captured. Others set fire to their vehicles, watching flames consume the machines that once symbolized power. And as they retreated through the frozen woods, the truth that had been building since the beginning of the operation finally hit with full force. The offensive wasn't halted by enemy brilliance or tactical genius. It was defeated by something far more crushing. Reality. A reality of empty fuel tanks. A reality of exhausted men. A reality of an industrial machine that could no longer keep up with a war it had started. What remained of the column straggled back toward German lines, tired, weakened, and forever changed. The offensive that had begun with such bold ambition ended not with a dramatic last stand, but with the quiet footsteps of men walking away from machines they could no longer power. And in that retreat, every soldier understood the final truth. The war had already been lost. They were just living through the moment when the world finally realized it. Allied resistance stiffened, the weather cleared, and air power returned to the skies. One by one, Piper's tanks ran dry again. Over 70 armored vehicles, including Panthers and Tigers, that were abandoned in the snow. Eventually, Piper and his men were forced to retreat on foot, leaving behind millions of dollars in equipment. The discovery of that fuel depot didn't save the German attack, and it exposed the core weakness of the entire German war machine. Germany could build powerful tanks, but it couldn't fuel them. Meanwhile, the United States had virtually unlimited oil, limitless production, and an unstoppable supply chain. This wasn't just the end of Kampfgruppe Piper. It was the moment the world saw that Germany's defeat was inevitable.